Welcome back to Crossroads. We're here live at Cross Labs in Kyoto. So we have a very exciting guest today, and we have a really cool topic, and we're all very excited to see all about, well, consciousness and robots, and maybe something a little spicy, as you might have seen from the title. So before we get started, I also would like to explain a little bit about what Crossroads is, especially in case you've never seen Crossroads before. So this is Cross Labs' monthly or twice monthly, or maybe sometimes even 3 times monthly, fun forum where we invite all sorts of speakers to come and give talks, discussions, panels, all sorts of things like that. And the topic generally has something to do about intelligence or consciousness, or maybe even machine learning or intelligence, because what we're really interested in here at Cross Labs is the fundamentals of, and not just fundamentals, but everything related to intelligence science. But it's such a big topic, and it's really hard to stick to just one discipline or one field. And that's why we invite all of these different speakers here to discuss their perspectives and all the really cool work that they do. So also, Crossroads is sponsored by Cross Compass, which is a leading AI technology company here in Japan. So without them, none of this would have been possible. So everybody thank them, and you should also check out their website. That's crosscompass.com. All right, so today's format is going to be our speaker, who is going to be giving a lovely talk, and then we're going to have a discussion following that as well. So if you're watching live on YouTube, we are going to be sharing a Slido link so that you can ask questions and participate in the discussion too. I'll be watching the Slido, and if you have a question, I'll definitely see it. So you definitely want to click on that Slido and ask your questions there. All right, so I don't want to take any more time from today's topic because it's going to be really exciting. So today we have Professor Axel Cleeremans. And he is all the way from Belgium, and he is a cognitive scientist who is going to be talking about consciousness. And also, of course, a very spicy title for the talk. So without further ado, I will now pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's really a great pleasure to be here, of course, on the occasion, on the eve of the meeting of the Association of for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, which will take place next week in Tokyo, and that has the entire consciousness community pretty excited. So, can a robot have an orgasm? It's a provocative question, which I can answer right away by saying no. But the talk is about the value of consciousness. What does it mean for us to be conscious? What is the value of having experiences is what I want to talk about. And so talking about orgasms in robots is one way of bringing up what some people have called synthetic phenomenology. That is the question of whether it's possible to build conscious, not merely intelligent, but conscious AI systems. Does the question even make sense? Can a robot have an orgasm? It is something weird to think about, and I think it's a very interesting question because it asks, can we build things that feel just like we do? And I think the question of synthetic pleasure in particular is particularly interesting because for pain, well, it's relatively easy, I think, to imagine how to equip any synthetic system with the algorithms necessary to avoid pain. But how do you make it possible for it to seek pleasure like all living organisms do? Not necessarily orgasms, but minimally homeostasis and satisfaction of multiple constraints that actually bring in us and presumably in many other elements pleasurable feelings. So there's an interesting asymmetry between pain and pleasure here, I think. For instance, one can talk, and one talks about chronic pain, nobody talks about chronic pleasure. And in that sense, pain is functional. The feeling of pain, you can readily see what the evolutionary advantages may be. Avoiding danger, preserving the organism, etc. And this is not so for pleasure, but it's a debate. Some people, and I remember discussing this with Dan Dennett, who's strongly disagreeing with the idea that there would be an asymmetry between pain and pleasure. I think there is. And so I think I'll just leave that on the table for now. And so, of course, this is about feelings. And um, have to bring up, of course, this very famous 1974 article authored by Thomas Nagel about what it's like to be a bat, because the what it is like expression has taken hold to describe what philosophers call qualia. So the qualities that accompany particular sensations or particular thoughts, even though people would disagree that thinking has any quality associated with it. But in Nagel's paper, he pointed out that no matter we know about the brain of a bat, we'll never know what it feels like to chase insects at dusk with a sensory system from which a sonar will later inspire itself from. So that's what it's about. It's about experience. Now, many people have dismissed experience in a way, in different ways, saying it doesn't matter or we cannot explain it, and so we'll have to focus on something else. And it's actually quite difficult to come up with a definition beyond what it's like expression. But whenever I think about this, I think that what it's like for me to see red is subsumed by the network of memory associations with the color red and with the valence associated with those memories. So for you, seeing red may remind you or be connected in somehow to playing with red trucks while you were a kid, with tomatoes, and then another link with pizza, with the color of the dress that your partner was wearing when you first met her, or with movies and zombies and vampires, etc., etc. And all these experiences, all these memories have a valence associated with it. For some of those red memories will be good memories. For others, there will be bad memories. And what it's like for me to see red, which also accounts for the subjective character of these experiences, because it's me seeing red, not you, seems to be subsumed by this network of associations. And so that is what most theories of consciousness aim to explain, but none is really close. I won't get into these four big theories here: integrated information theory, higher order thought theory, global workspace theory, predictive processing or recurrent processing theory. Those are the big names in the field. Of course, everybody has his own theory of consciousness, because you cannot be someone in this field without having some sort of theory about consciousness. But those are the big four. And except for IIT, the others have just put experience aside a little bit. They've focused on, this is particularly true for global workspace, they've focused on the cognitive consequences of consciousness. And this gets me here. When you think about consciousness in general, there's two kinds of questions you can ask. One is, how are we conscious? And so this is a question about the mechanisms of consciousness, be that computational mechanisms or neural correlates, as people have called them, mechanisms of consciousness. But there's also the why question. Why is it the case that we're conscious? And that's the question I'm interested in these days. And that's a question about the function of consciousness. What is it that consciousness makes it possible for us to do that wouldn't be possible without consciousness? And when you look at how people have approached this why question in the literature, you find that this distinction, which was introduced by Ned Block between what's called access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. Access consciousness is what consciousness does. It's about the functional consequences of conscious mental states. That is the how question. And the why question is about the phenomenal aspects of consciousness, what it feels like, right? That's what Block calls phenomenal consciousness. And this distinction between access and phenomenal consciousness has been absolutely important in the field, both driving what people are looking at, but also defining how we think about consciousness as a whole. The how aspects have been looked at mostly by cognitive neuroscientists who focused, as I said, on the mechanisms, on the neural or computational correlates of consciousness. And by and large, if you look at what these guys have been saying, they say, well, phenomenal experience doesn't do much, or minimally, this remains something which is out of reach of scientific exploration, so we'll leave it aside. And if you look at the why question, this is something that philosophers have mostly focused on. And there's a diversity of viewpoints there, but in many cases, you also find this idea that mental states cannot be causally effective. This is Kim's causal exclusion argument. This is the idea that, well, if everything can be reduced to whatever neurons do or to whatever elementary particles do, what room is there for experiences to play a functional role in whatever we do? It's the same quandary than has been brought forward by the debates around free will. Basically, if you can reduce everything to the deterministic movements of elementary particles, what room is there for us to decide about anything? And so in that sense, in philosophy, in many cases, consciousness has been depicted at best as an illusion, but most often as an epiphenomenon that has no functional consequences. So in both cases, we're concluding that what it feels like is a sort of epiphenomenon, something that comes on top of the functions and that is separate from those functions. Chalmers has argued in exactly that same direction. Now, the thrust of what we're trying to do here is to say, well, this distinction, as useful as it has been, needs to go, basically. I think that both conclusions are wrong here, and that we need to think of the function of consciousness, of phenomenal consciousness, and I think that the function of phenomenal consciousness is to give value to what we do. That's why the talk is called The Value of Consciousness. Because indeed, what would be the point of doing anything at all if the doing wasn't doing something to you as a subject, right? What would be the point? We would just sit there doing nothing if nothing mattered or meant or anything to us, if nothing had value. That is why conscious agents care about their experiences in a way that zombies or AI systems do not. And that means that consciousness matters. And I call this the phenomenal primacy thesis. We need to not begin, this is what IIT would say, but we need to take it into account that what feels like has functions, has consequences, basically, which is going against the grain of many streams of contemporary thinking about this issue. Here's that blog saying phenomenal consciousness is experience, the phenomenally conscious aspect of a state, of a mental state, is what it is like to be in that state. The mark of access consciousness, by contrast, is availability for use in reasoning and rationally guiding speech and action. That's the definition between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. Now, here's Keith Frankish, who says, well, a conceptual distinction does not necessarily mark an ontological one. Of course, two distinct concepts, like phenomenal and access consciousness, may pick out the same thing. And I think he's right. This distinction introduced by Ned Block as a way of thinking and separating the easy and hard problems in a way has now run its course, and it's become toxic a little bit because people take it to be an ontological distinction, whereas it's meant to be a conceptual one, basically. His Chalmers about epiphenomenalism, I will not read this, but he ends up confessing in his 1996 book that, yeah, well, his position of natural dualism leads to the perspective that whatever you feel like is a pure epiphenomenon, which I think is a problematic view. Frankish, the quote of whom I liked in the previous slide, is perhaps the foremost person with Dennett, who's now deceased, of this philosophical position called illusionism, which is not denying the existence of qualia, but basically saying it's not what you think it is. And so everything that you feel is a sort of illusion. There may be elements of that one can like about this, but I think it's sort of edging also in an area that I think is problematic when you think about phenomenal consciousness. And of course, in psychology now, you have a very strong, which is under attack these days, a very strong perspective that whatever we can do with awareness, we can also do without. And so this is all the work on everything that we can do unconsciously, basically. But I feel here it has gotten too far as well. People claim that you can do arithmetic unconsciously. People have claimed that it's better not to think about a complex problem when you're making a complex decision, but just to let it sit or do something else. It's not entirely wrong, but again, it's a slippery slope. And in fact, if you ask people, do you think unconscious or subliminal processing has been convincingly demonstrated in the literature? It's only 64% of experts who think that that is the case, but everybody says, well, it should exist, right? So there's this gap between what people think should be the case and what has actually been shown using very complicated, sophisticated psychophysical methods. And of course, this is also brought up by all the discussion about conscious AI. I mean, here's AlphaGo beating Lee Sedol. We all know this. But the point is, this is clearly artificial intelligence. It isn't artificial consciousness, because who drinks the champagne when AlphaGo wins the tournament? It's not AlphaGo, it's Demis Hassibis and the guys at DeepMind. And this makes the very point. AlphaGo doesn't even realize that it's in a tournament. It doesn't realize how important his victory against Lee Sedol is. Why? Well, because there's nothing it's like to be AlphaGo. And so, because AlphaGo is not conscious. You've seen this, books by Harari discussing this. There's lots of these days. Very interesting question. People, I think, erroneously think that more work on artificial intelligence will lead to conscious machines. I think that's completely wrong. I think AI, artificial intelligence, and artificial consciousness are completely orthogonal to each other. You can build superhumanly intelligent machines like AlphaGo, and we all know that you can be conscious but also very stupid. So I think these are dimensions that have nothing to do with each other, and it's not by thinking about how to build even more intelligent computers that we'll get to artificial consciousness. And so all these developments that I've pointed out sort of tend to squish phenomenal experience in increasingly small corners. In philosophy, there's illusionism, epiphenomenalism, reductive physicalism, hard determinism that diminish the import of the subject and of what we feel as subjects. From psychology, we have this idea of the powerful unconscious, the focus on neural correlates of consciousness, whereas it's essentially a subject level phenomenon. And now from AI, of course, we have even more squishing, because we can see how much we can do without consciousness and without agency, without intentionality. And I think this, this is problematic in a way as a development, because it's, everything gets algorithmized or algorithmic, and it sort of squishes what we feel, which is so important, which feels so important to each of us, in something that one cannot explain, that one should leave aside, that one can reduce to nothing, etc., etc. Frege got it right. He said, it seems absurd to us that a pain, a mood, a wish should rover about the world without a bearer independently. An experience, he says, is impossible without an experience. And we forgot about that looking at the NCC, the neural correlates of consciousness, or looking at what we can do with machines. The inner world, mental states does, mental attitudes, presupposes the person whose inner world it is. And so another author that brought this very clearly is Charles Stewart, who's a philosopher. 1998, there's a book, The Significance of Consciousness, and he asks people to engage in the following thought experiments. Suppose I offer you, he says, in exchange for something truly valuable to be zombified. And by this he means everything stays the same. You keep all your non-phenomenal goods, but it doesn't feel like anything for you to be you anymore, right? So, but you keep your money, you keep your agency, etc. But everything is dark inside, right? Would you accept this? And of course, we would say no. What is the point? If I don't feel anything at all, what would be the point of having anything at all? What would be the point of doing anything at all? It would be just as good as being dead, basically. And that's the core intuition. People would not accept zombification, which means that it means something for us to have experiences, basically. And indeed, everything that I choose to do at any moment seems to be motivated by the sorts of experiences I want to have and the sorts of experiences I want to avoid having, either very short term or very long term. It doesn't matter. But everything that I choose to do, every act that I make, seems to be motivated by choices that are about that specifically. So, a few words about why we're conscious then. I wrote this paper, which I recommend, with Catherine Talon-Baudry a couple of years ago. This was 2022, titled Consciousness Matters, Phenomenal Experience Has Functional Value, in which we develop these arguments. And in the paper, we argue that the core function of consciousness is precisely to endow subjective experience, what we feel like, with intrinsic value. In other words, what consciousness does is to make it possible for an agent to feel things. Follows from that claim the idea that all subjective experiences are endowed with intrinsic value. As an example from the paper, the difference between eating a good meal and being fed intravenously, like in a hospital, both serve the same physiological function, but obviously one is associated with pleasurable experiences, the other not. Why do the pleasurable experiences matter in this particular case? Computing subjective value enables agents to free themselves from the shackles of evolution. You cannot understand why people do things like base jumping, or jumping in parachutes, or even crazier things that many people do, without while dismissing what it feels like. The reason they do it is only because of what it feels like, for the thrill of it, basically. And it's so important, that feeling, that they're even willing to put their lives at risk. This also explains drugs, etc. So we do many things that are against evolution, and we're not the only ones. Here is this crow sledding on a plastic lid, basically, and he keeps doing it on the snowy roof. And there's many examples of dogs engaging in such behavior, etc. And this goes well beyond the monkeys, whom some species of monkeys, where you understand how they're part of large social groups, and this seems to have a function there. Here, it seems to be purely for the hedonic qualities of that are associated with the behavior. If you think of experiences as having value, well, then you can talk about phenomenal experience as a sort of currency, to the extent that all your experiences take place in a unified phenomenal space that is shaped by the subject's cognitive and affective history, that is her preferences, right? This explains um, partly the unity of consciousness and the fact that we can readily engage in bizarre comparisons, like, would you rather having a day off next month or have a dessert today, right? We can compare vastly different things, and the idea is that all takes place in a unified phenomenal space. That is also what makes it possible for us to trade experiences. Not only can we share experiences by talking, for instance, but we can also, people are also selling experiences. There's something called, as I found out, there's something called experiential tourism. So it's not about where you go; it's what you would experience there, and the trip is marketed by focusing on the experience, right? Same goes for restaurants, etc. So clearly, experiences have some value, and that raises the issue of very interesting issue of whether value can be unconscious, or whether affect in general can be unconscious. That's the topic of the symposium next week at ASSC that I'm organizing with Chris Delega. Does it make sense to talk of unconscious rewards? Reinforcement learning algorithms, for instance, in AI are driven by rewards, but the rewards themselves only seem to have extrinsic value. It's as though the rewards are out there in the world, but of course, what you want is a system for which rewards are intrinsic to their own experiences, right? So the key for a reward to have intrinsic value is subjective experience, because if there is a reward, but there's nobody there who can experience the reward, then the reward doesn't mean anything, right? This is what, I forgot their names now, but it was a very good paper called the reward paradox, the fact that experiences have to have intrinsic value for the agent, They cannot just be laid out in the world, but that is the way most reinforcement learning algorithms work at this point. Mark Solms, writing about feelings and affect, asked the same question: can they be unconscious? And he writes this, which I really enjoyed. What is the point of becoming aware of physical processes if your awareness has no influence upon those processes? Epiphenomenalism. What can the function of feeling go on? How can the function of feeling go on in the dark without any feeling? We can legitimately ask why vision is accompanied by conscious experience, because he says vision does not require consciousness, and neither does any cognitive process, but feeling does. There can be no such thing as a feeling that you do not feel. Unconscious feeling is an oxymoron. Yet some people argue, well, yes, there are unconscious emotions, affect, etc. And it's a complicated question. I don't want to go into psychoanalysis. And there's a sense in which it is right that you can have unconscious affect, but it's much more complicated than many people think it is. So if you adopt this view that what it's like has intrinsic value, then you focus on the central role that subjects play in this entire theory building. Learning plays a central role because that is through learning and plasticity that preferences emerge. You have this idea of multimodal integration in a subject-centered phenomenal space. You account for unity of consciousness, you account for intrinsic motivation to act, which is not the case for any AI system at this point. They just seem to sit there waiting to get a prompt. And it deflates unconscious processing. So how we feel things explains why consciousness matters. Now, how do we think about the why? How do we think about the why? This is all good. This is laying out the problem, but there's a question of how we move forward. And this is what I've been trying to do with this project from the European Research Council, the ERC, that I got last year. And so I have a whole group now thinking about these issues, including philosophers and psychologists. Basically, there's three strategies that people have been following. There's conceptual or analytical arguments, evolutionary or AI arguments, and then empirical evidence. And I'll go pretty quickly over the first two. So conceptual arguments, Alexander Klein, with whom we have a project now, has connected this discussion to William James, one of the founding fathers of psychology, who wrote back then already that there's a link between what phenomenally feels good or bad and what physically benefits or harms us. And so there already is a link in a way, even if these early, in these early thinking about phenomenal consciousness between valence, value, danger, pain, pleasure, and the existence of feelings. But it's a complicated problem. He's Stephen Fleming, who writes about functions of phenomenal experience, because that's what we're trying to find, right? And then he says, well, one perspective is that consciousness is causal, phenomenal consciousness is causal. You cannot implement function X without being conscious of the inputs, the outputs, or the process of X. So you might be able to see a painting unconsciously, for instance, but you wouldn't have any appreciation of it, right? Unless you were conscious of it. And interestingly, I think we're finding out now that you don't need to be conscious to generate art, but maybe you need, because so many systems can actually do that, but maybe you do need consciousness to appreciate art. It's also debatable, because I understand there are AI systems now that can judge the quality of a piece of artwork. But so that's one perspective, consciousness as causal. The other perspective is that consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, is a consequence of implementing a particular function. And so in this perspective, consciousness is in one sense epiphenomenal, as it comes along for the ride as a consequence of implementing particular functions. And so if you, like me, is convinced that consciousness is causal, then you have to follow the first route. This is another paper that has lots of interesting discussion about the relationship between the functions that are necessary for consciousness and the functions that are sufficient for consciousness. And so the difference between the functional basis of consciousness and the functional contribution of consciousness, basically. I won't get into that at all. This is a complicated piece of writing, but just point out that there really is this loop between understanding what the functional basis of consciousness is, which is the how question in a way, is it implemented, and what it actually does in return. So there's this loop, and as soon as there's a loop, I get lost. And I think many people working on causality get a little bit lost too. This is a huge complexity, I think, with all this work, because recurrence is involved, and you're looping through levels, Hofstadter was claiming. Okay, evolutionary AI arguments. So I mentioned the reward paradox, and I still, Witkowski and Summerfield, yes. Where does value come from? Those are the authors. So the stimulus view must be inferred by the agent, not conferred by the world. In other words, rewards must be intrinsic, not extrinsic, and this they call the reward paradox. Most reinforcement learning algorithms, which have proven how successful they may be, are based on the idea that rewards are sort of labeled out there, and the problem for the agent is to find those rewards. But your reward can be my pain. You know, it's completely subjective, and so what AI needs to do is to make it so that the reward is truly intrinsic. And the argument is, well, this cannot take place unless we have a good idea of what phenomenal experience is like for a particular subject. There's interesting discussions too about sexual selection here, which is Darwin's second selection process, playing along natural selection. Evolutionary psychologists have written quite a lot about this. I don't like this work so much. There's better work, I think, by biologists, but Geoffrey Miller famously proposed in The Mating Mind that our minds evolved not just as survival machines, so natural selection, but as courtship machines. Every one of our ancestors managed not just to live for a while, but to convince at least one sexual partner to have enough sex to produce offspring, right? So he's basically saying, oh, big brains are to seduce other people. And I think that's interesting because the link with consciousness is the fact that when you're trying to understand the mind of someone else, you have to assume unobservable mental states, basically. And this promotes the sort of recurrent looking at yourself sort of mechanism that I think is instrumental for consciousness. There's 3 books about the evolution of beauty, because animals have these incredible sexual ornaments, like the peacock's tail, etc., incredible dance of birds of paradise. Why is that the case? How does that work? Why is, you know, I mean, it's actually metabolically very costly to maintain the peacock's tail, etc. So it can only serve the function of seducing members of the other sex. Here's Richard Crum, with whom we had a discussion around all these issues. And here's a male bird of paradise. I don't know if the video will work all the way, trying to seduce a female. And even being aware of the fact that you don't want to anthropomorphize these behaviors, you cannot help but think that he's actively trying to manipulate her mental states, basically. You know, look at this amazing display. And she's just looking at this guy doing his dance, and then ending up deciding, well, yes, I will let him mate with me or not. In this particular case, he's very disappointed because she flies away. And so it's going to be someone else. But the point is, look at this amazing complexity that's taken millions of years of evolution. How do you explain that? Unless you assume mental states, unless you assume that the dance is doing something to the mental states of the female. And in fact, there's some birds that have bones that you can see here that are necessary on their feathers to produce particular sounds involved in sexual parades, and that are completely dysfunctional from the point of view of flying, because they're heavy, they have these spikes instead of being hollow, so as to be light, like is the case in most bones of most birds, of all birds, in fact. These bones are full. So completely dysfunctional bones in the service of sexual selection. And then in this evolutionary psychology domain, you have other people like Pinker saying, about music. Music shows no sign of design for attaining a goal such as long life, grandchildren, or accurate perception and prediction of the world. Compared with language, vision, social reasoning, and physical know-how, music could vanish from a species and the rest of our lifestyle would be virtually unchanged. So he's a hardcore reductionist about it, but he's basically saying everything that we do in terms of arts and beauty and music, etc., is just pointless. I have to disagree with that completely. I think it's precisely in the service of sexual selection there, according to the biologists. So now, empirical evidence. This is what I'm trying to do now. How do we turn this into an empirical project? And for this, I'm looking back at the work that I've carried out with Antoine a little bit. So we're beginning with this idea that consciousness depends on tangled loops at a Hofstadter a little bit, and that it really has to do with this inner loop that goes on between first order processing, unconscious vision, I'm seeing something, it's in my visual cortex, and meta representations that redescribe those first order states to the subject, which I think, according to higher order thought theory, define the difference between conscious and unconscious mental states. So you have three loops in this framework: a perception action loop, a self-over loop, and then this crucial inner loop, where the system looks at itself and attempts to redescribe its own representations, basically. And with Antoine, we developed this idea of redescription by using very simple connectionist networks, backprop networks with 3 layers. And so here's a simple network that can go from perception to action. And the idea is that this is all fine, but it's all first order processing. Let's imagine what happens now if this entire first order network becomes input to a meta representational network, a network, the goal of which is to describe the way processing takes place in the first order network, right? Horizontally, you have the brain learning about the world. This is type 1 decisions. This is unconscious processing. Vertically, when this meta network redescribes what the first order network is doing, this really is about the brain learning about itself. It's doing signal detection on its own representations. And by high order thought theory, I think this is crucial for phenomenal experience. These are the 2 papers that we did with Antoine and Bert Timmermans. And interestingly now, we're collaborating with Guillaume Dumas, who's picked up on these ideas, and we're trying to modernize the computational underpinnings of this entire work. And he's successfully replicated the work that we did, what was it now, 15 years ago, 20 years ago almost. He successfully replicated that using more modern computational methods, and we're trying to see how we can move forward with this core idea that phenomenal consciousness involves redescribing your own representations. In parallel to that, we're also trying to map the phenomenal space in a way. This is great work by Hebart et al., looking at similarity relationships and trying to map out how many dimensions people use in order to categorize what they're seeing, basically. So this is not about affect, it's just about similarity, but we're trying to use the same methods to argue that all conscious perception is valenced, which is one way of supporting the idea that phenomenal experience has intrinsic value. If phenomenal experience has intrinsic value, then there should be valence everywhere. And the point is, if I look at this bottle, I have an attitude towards it. I can like the design or I can dislike the design for different sorts of reasons. And this has been called microvalence. Zayong wrote, "We do not just see a house, we always see a handsome house, an ugly house, or a pretentious house," right? So everything, every perception has a valence. And it's Sophie de Brecht who developed this idea of microvalences. If you look at affective neurosciences, people use images of knives on the left, on the top or images of flowers to denote positive and negatively valenced stimuli, but those are strongly valenced stimuli. Brecht argued that the stimuli that affective neuroscientists use as the control cases, the neutral items like houses, etc., actually do have a valence too, a small valence, a microvalence. And so right now we're using representational similarity analysis to compare what networks do, what people do in similarity judgments, and what people do in tasks that connect with valence to try to figure out how the phenomenal space is shaped by valence, but what you like and what you don't like. And the idea is to end up proving that all conscious perception is valenced, or that most conscious perception is valenced. And it should be everywhere. It should be there in priming, in learning, in decision-making, in perception. So we're running all these tasks. We're starting the project, so this is ongoing work by my students, Ines Mentek and my postdoc Yvan Evanche. We've done things like use AlexNet, look at the what the network does at different layers, and try to correlate that with people's microvalences. And interestingly, we're finding the strongest correlation in the early convolutional layers, as though, and some human studies have shown this as well, as though valence was really not post-perceptual, but part of perception, right? It means it's part of perception, just like shape or color is part of perception, which would support this idea that all conscious perception is valenced. Another thing that we're trying to do is to show that only conscious perception is valenced. If there can be no unconscious affect, then only conscious mental states should be associated with valence. To do that, we manipulate consciousness as a variable. We use this screen, which can display stimuli with microsecond durations, so 1/1,000,000th of a second, which makes it possible to achieve invisibility without masking. And so we're developing this minimal exposure duration using this instrument that makes it possible to see just how much energy you need to show people. So what duration you need to show people for some processing step to take place. And so with this, we can figure out, for instance, if valence is post-perceptual or not. You need to be aware to attribute valence or not. And recently, another postdoc, Renzo Lanfranco, has carried out a study looking at faces. I will not develop this in detail, but here is Renzo. There's a preprint, which normally should be a paper very soon, we hope. But he looked at how people process faces and what they can do at different durations. And the main results are here. We can discriminate a face from its scrambled counterpart with just 2.6 seconds of exposure. 2.6 milliseconds of exposure. Both psychophysics and EEG experiments he carried out convergently suggest holistic face processing, which requires feature integration in about 4.3 milliseconds. But emotion processing, that is figuring out what emotion the face is exhibiting, that seems to require 6 milliseconds. And so here, it seems that you really need to be perceptually aware of the fact that there was a face on the screen to be able to indicate which emotion the face was displaying. And in a way, as I'm saying this, it feels obvious, but in the literature, you find a lot of evidence that valence can be computed outside of awareness. And I think this, in fact, doesn't hold, that if you do the experiments with state-of-the-art methods that make it possible to figure out what processing stages take place, you come to the opposite conclusion. So that's one bit. All conscious perception is valenced, only conscious perception is valenced. The second part of the project is to show that intentional action cannot be driven by unconscious incentives. So you need to be aware of rewards for those rewards to have effects. Some people claim that you can show people an invisible image of a high value coin, for instance, invisible because it's masked. So when you ask people, was the coin high or low value, they say, I don't know, or they choose randomly. But the claim is that if the coin was high value, people will exert more effort by pressing harder on a hand grip, for instance, to obtain a fraction of the reward. I don't believe these studies, so we're trying to redo it with the same instrument that we have and prove, and Lina Skoha has done quite a bit of work in that direction as well, that you really do need to be aware for the reward to be processed. So motivation requires awareness. I cannot motivate you by the promise of an unconscious reward. And in the fourth bit of the project, we're going to look at placebo and placebo suggestion in particular, and see if we can turn people's experiences the other way around. So can we convince people, for instance, that they're seeing a green strawberry when the strawberry is really red? This is something that Zoltan Dienes calls phenomenal control. It's also what's involved in hypnosis. And the idea here is to prove that what we feel, just like in the placebo effect, changes what we do, basically, or what we experience. All right, I'll skip that. And I'm close to being done now. So here's a few conclusions. If it comes. So why are we conscious? Well, because conscious agents care about the mental states they find themselves in. I've argued that a core function of consciousness is to endow subjective experience with subject-level value. So what consciousness does is to make it possible for an agent to feel things. I think of functional mechanisms that makes that possible is an eccentric multimodal phenomenal space, which actually combines aspects of different extant theories of consciousness. And I think this points that the experiencing subject should be at the heart of theories of consciousness, something that many such theories have forgotten. I'd like to quote Dennett at this point, who said, who asked, how do we go from doing things for reasons to having reasons for doing things? And I think this exactly captures the juncture in evolution that we're interested in, because many organisms do things that have been set up for good evolutionary reasons. The earthworm behaves in the way it does because evolution has shaped it to be able to survive doing the things it does, and likewise for all the animals. So there's good reasons that explains why all animals, including us or all plants even, behave in the way that we do. But it seems that only humans and perhaps a few other species have reasons of their own to behave in the way they do. Only humans have reasons to go base jumping, etc., etc. So I think this is a great quote to capture this distinction. So finding a function for phenomenal experience, I think, is an urgent philosophical problem. Consciousness matters in a way that is not reflected properly in AI, in many quarters of philosophy of mind, in many quarters of cognitive neuroscience. This is a link to the website of the ERC project that I have been discussing. This is my team, and then the QR code is there again, and I'm done. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. Amazing experiments and literature and ideas. It was, for me, I was just watching and I was like, this is such
Great,
a wealth
cool.
of information. It was really cool. So we have a room full of lots of people here, actually. I don't know if the camera can see it, but so I want to open up for discussion, especially for the people in the room. I've taken my mic off so we can hand it around. So I'm also going to pull up the Slido as well. So if you're watching live, please ask your question in the Slido and we can add it to the discussion. So yeah, so I want to step back. I'm not, I don't want to take away from the discussion. So does anybody want to? Yeah, Antoine.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. Well, I just want to first say that this is a real pleasure to welcome you again at Crossroads, because this is not the first time you are with us in Japan. in person, doing a presentation here at Crossroads. So thank you for that. And also, yeah, the topic, of course, is very interesting to me. I had the pleasure of doing my PhD under your mentorship. So obviously, I'm very attached to this topic. So now this hypothesis, if we may call it this way, of yours is that we have value that is attached to our perception, and that is the function of consciousness. All right. So I think this is a good way of answering the why question, as you say, but I also feel that this may be incomplete, and so I'd like to have a little more of explanation on your part. So to me, it explains why we have consciousness, as you say, but it doesn't explain why it occurs the way it does. That is basically what is the mechanism that produces the subjective experience from the value. I think you left this out of the discussion right now, and I feel like only half the problem has been, potentially found a solution here. So this other half, the mechanism, to me, it's lacking from your presentation, and I'd like to have a little more insight on this, please.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Obviously, I'm not going to answer that question right away, but I think the mechanism is, there's many good potential mechanisms out there. Global workspace is one. Personally, I think higher order thought theory is the best attempt at coming up with a mechanism that makes it possible to differentiate between conscious and unconscious mental states. But even that is missing the point on the importance of affect, basically, right? Higher order thought theory is this theory that I described, to which you contributed, where, okay, you have first order processing going on, and then other networks, it's not just a single network, but systems of matter representations that are characterizing what is going on in these first order causal chains. And not just what is represented at each stage, each layer of a deep learning network, for instance, but also how information is dynamically processed by the network. And this, you really need this meta representational layer to do things like distinguishing between a genuine perception and a memory, because in the genuine perception, input will come from the retina or whatever sensory organs you have. In a memory, it's, the way information flows into the system is different. But the system itself doesn't know that unless it has an observing system, the function of which is to make these distinctions. And the point is to say, well, in addition to being able to express confidence, for instance, which also, I think, requires a meta representational system, in addition to making the distinction between imagination and reality, as in the case of hallucinations and so on and so forth, the crucial bit here is that these meta representational systems also capture how much the system as a whole likes those first order information pathways, basically. Does it like what's going on there? Does it regret it? All these mental attitudes. Is it, do I fear this? Do I hope for this? Do I regret this? Do I like this? And so on and so forth. That is all about affect. That is all about emotion. And I think that is the difference that having those meta-representational systems make. So the mechanism is the same mechanism that you worked on. It's the mechanisms of metacognitive networks. Basically.
So we did it already.
What? Well, in a way, yes, but from the purely computational point of view, and we discussed this on many occasions, how do you train a network to regret a first-order mental state? How do you train a network to? So it's unclear what the goals should be, what the computational goals of those meta-representational systems should be. So now we're still talking about AI systems that have no, I mean, they're immortal, so they don't care about dying, etc., etc. So all these issues are, I think, strikingly different in AI systems than they are for actual living biological systems, where a lot of the groundwork has already been set up by natural selection, for instance. So every living system cares about its own existence in a way that no AI system does. And so, in a way, probably phenomenal consciousness is in that way connected with life, biological life, which doesn't mean that it's impossible to duplicate it in artificial life, but it will require some interesting work that I understand you guys here are working on. Yeah,
Of course.
Yeah, and then let's go to Olaf.
All right. Well, this gives me a chance to thank you for coming here for the second time. You're right. You were here already a few years ago in our Tokyo office. This is our Kyoto office, and I'm really glad to find a lot of things that several of us are working actively on. My favorite bits are about maybe hypnosis and how it relates to that, and maybe dimensionality of phenomenal experience. And also, I guess, recognizing and communicating sentience, different affects that some people here work actively on. But maybe just on this, maybe to follow up on that, how about talking a little bit about, I would like to hear more about the AI sentient stuff. So maybe my question about hybrid agents, to have something in between. I wonder what you think about hybrid agents, basically. So it will be something like the Searle's replacement kind of argument, right? But maybe made a bit more complex to this case, more specific. So even if AI cannot experience pleasure or pain, this kind of stuff, what happens when as we complex bio types of life increasingly offload or hybridize ourselves and build prosthetics, extend into the technological world? And to a certain extent, we do it with science and with pieces of biology through evolution. What is different, and is there something stopping the causality? Because I hear epiphenomenal kind of theory of this stuff is saying that causality goes one way, right? But we are seeing that both ways is important. So what stops when we offload or maybe integrate with technology?
What stops or what begins?
Or what begins? It's both.
I don't see that as a particularly problematic issue. I think we're already augmented in many different ways. You can think of course, helping people who are unable to experience something. So there's lots of research, for instance, on enabling blind people to perceive some visual aspects of the world, including artificial retinas, etc., or sensory substitution systems. So in a way, of course, we're going to get a lot more of that, particularly as work on brain-machine interfaces gets going. It already does in different ways. So if I can now play a video game with my mind, why not? It's already a form of augmentation. But who's doing the feeding? I think it's, in a sense, maybe it's the total system. But that total system wouldn't experience anything unless you were still in there somewhere, right? So I don't think, because I think that this is all really subject level based. Some people would disagree with this, but just like Frege, even though this is sort of a misquote, I think you cannot talk of an experience unless there's an experience. That is the key. Some people argue, well, yes, you can have a first order system can have states that you can describe as experiences, right? That's how you come to be able to talk about unconscious affect. So there's affect going on, or there's an experience going on in a first order system, except you're not paying attention maybe, or it's still unconscious in some way. And I have a huge problem with these sorts of characterizations
Right.
of experiences, because I think experiences always involve this system, this loop between meta-representational systems and first-order representations. And so experiences always belong to the subject who's engaging in this meta-representational activity.
Mhm.
And so, so in that sense, even if you have a hybrid system, what hybridizing means is that you're just adding first-order systems that perhaps enrich your experiences in different ways. But it's still you as a human subject who's doing the experiencing.
As the one, right? So
As the one, yes.
later we'll talk about distributed cognitions. But but
okay.
if I take something like Google Maps to make sure, can I paraphrase by saying that Google Maps would absorb some of our intelligence and ability to orient ourselves, but you're saying that something that is the affect or the pleasure, for example, would not be absorbed by the prosthetic. It will go back to the main agent. Is that what I'm hearing, or I'm simplifying?
No, I think you're right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Interesting. We need to talk about that.
Yeah. Okay.
Because I'm afraid that it wouldn't be true in some very crucial cases.
Such as what?
But
Well,
let's chat more.
okay.
Amazing.
Let's see. And then there was an anonymous question. I don't know if somebody here asked it. If they want to. Oh, did you?
No,
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Non-anonymous question.
Okay. Perfect. So this anonymous question is saying about the millionth of a second experiment. This cool box, which I thought that was amazing.
T-scope, yeah.
Yes. So it might also mean that just as a noise image about a transformer, it takes steps for us to process emotion, not consciousness. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, I'm not sure what it means to process consciousness. If the question is about, well, you're aware as soon as you're looking at what's going on the screen, that's certainly true. The point of this experiment was to go against people who claim, well, I can show you an invisible face of an angry person, and that's going to make you act in certain ways, for instance, rather than others, right? So the idea that you can have an unconscious emotion out there, an angry face, for instance, you ask people, did you see anything? No, I just saw the mask. But then they answer differently on a questionnaire. They behave differently towards another social agent. I think that doesn't work. I think that doesn't work because, according to our findings, well, first of all, I would find it very strange in a way, right? But here, what we're finding is that computing emotion takes more time than computing more elementary aspects of face perception. And it seems to be the case that being able to discriminate something about the emotional state of a face always seems to come after other processing stages that involve other kinds of perceptual processing of the face. That's the claim. So I'm skeptical about the idea that you can have unconscious stimuli moving you about, basically. I'm not saying, but this is a different, complicated discussion. I'm not saying that some of our affective behaviors cannot be automatic. I think that's the case. You know, we automatically behave certain ways towards certain stimuli. The claim is specifically against the idea that I can manipulate your emotions with stimuli that you fail to consciously perceive. So that I think doesn't work out. And there's also cases like, you know, it's a complicated landscape between subliminal situations and automatic situations. So I think all sorts of behaviors that we exhibit can be driven by aspects of the world that you don't necessarily completely process, that you process without attention. So for instance, you get into a hospital or into a church and you automatically lower your voice. I don't think we're aware of this all the time, but I do think that we're aware of the fact that we're in a church, that we're in a hospital, etc. It's just that we don't think about it, and so the behavior is initiated before we actually realize what's going on. So it has become a sort of cognitive reflex, so to speak. So in that sense, yes, I think affect, emotion, or stimuli can influence what you do in an effective way. I don't think showing an invisible image of an angry face will drive you to do anything at all.
That makes sense. That's good news for people who are afraid of unconscious message, subliminal messaging in advertisements, for example. So that's right. I think your answer is reassuring. So we're gonna go here, and then also Joe has a couple questions as well. So
Thanks, Axel. That's a very interesting talk, and thanks, Olaf, for the invitation to join your group here. Thank you, thanks, Alyssa, for the directions and everything. So this sort of follows from the earlier question. I really love the idea of centering consciousness matter, and the efforts to place the emphasis on the importance of phenomenal experience, and particularly coming to provide a functional account for the importance of phenomenal experience. And although you mentioned for the main theories, you didn't really elaborate much on exactly how it is. So what are some of the mechanisms that they invoke in trying to make to factor the role of phenomenal consciousness? But let's just take the global workspace theory. So, and this is sort of relevant to the question about how do we move from merely studying consciousness to basically simulating it. So the whole question of synthetic phenomenology. So if you take the global workspace theory, right, so the idea there is that we have basically the one system, we have the global availability, right, and that's usually sort of the captures the transitive function of conscious cognitive processes. So the vision is for seeing, sensory motor tasks are for grabbing objects or navigating and so on and so forth. So that captures the transitive aspect of conscious phenomenology. But we also have the intransitive aspects, which is what we might refer the self-monitoring aspect, right? So so many have argued that we could use these two systems, the global availability and the self-monitoring, captures the sort of the intransitive or reflexive aspect of conscious mental states, to build systems. In other words, if we understand enough of how the two systems work, we could build a machine that in principle simulates, right, what it is like to move through the world as a conscious agent. But they would behave as if they're conscious, not necessarily be conscious. So we could go very close to simulating in high resolution, fine detail exactly how a conscious agent operates in the world. But that still doesn't capture what we refer to by the phenomenal aspect of consciousness, that what it is like, the qualitative aspect. So what do we say to someone that says, well, look, we build a system that, it's approximates as close as it is possible. But it doesn't really have, it's still, for all intents and purposes, a non-conscious system. It performs computationally, but it's not, there's no there. There is really no, even its sort of self-monitoring systems don't really amount to what we regard as phenomenology. So in other words, that raises a big question mark. Is synthetic phenomenology in some sense a category mistake? That is, can phenomenology itself be synthesized? So if you can elaborate a little bit on that, that'll be terrific.
Yeah,
Sure.
No, I don't really know what to say. Can it have an orgasm? That's that would be the question. But there's multiple issues, right? First, how do we tell? It's not obvious. We wrote recently a paper trying to think about tests of consciousness, and it turns out to be a very tricky question. Of course, we're all convinced, each of us, as conscious here, but we're relying on intuitive knowledge, and and as it turns out, as the old argument goes, one of us could be a robot, and a very sophisticated robot, and I would, what would be, how would I tell? It's a complicated issue. So if we get as close as we can, as you're suggesting with the global workspace and this idea, the self-monitoring isn't really part of the global workspace, I would say. Some people have argued that it needs metacognition, so it needs more of this reflexive loop. I don't know. I think your point makes it clear this would still be a completely cognitive theory of consciousness, and so it's still missing affect, it's still missing emotion. And as we were discussing earlier, perhaps that is connected to life in ways that we do not fully understand yet. I would want that system to be motivated to do something for its own, and that requires minimally learning, because it has to learn what it wants and what it likes, as opposed to be programmed to do that. So the global workspace doesn't learn.
Right.
So you need a system that actually goes through existence and has an opportunity to find out what it likes and what it dislikes. So that would be minimal. And then things like pain and pleasure have to mean something to it, which means it has something, which probably means it has to have some sort of body or sensorium at least, or sensory surface that makes it possible for things to feel good or bad to it. So there's lots of missing elements. I don't think we're going to get as close to phenomenal consciousness with just a sophisticated global workspace. I think we need many more moving parts.
Okay, just a quick follow-up. So you mentioned, you used the word intrinsic a couple of times when referring to consciousness. So would you say that, for instance, given that consciousness occurs in organisms like us, that it's intrinsic to biophysical systems? And if it is so, then it's sort of going to be very hard to extricate it out of that. I mean, to sort of think of what it would be like to have that property or that functionality in a system that doesn't have those sorts of properties.
Yeah, these are all extremely complicated questions. But,
anyway,
I think the first step is to have artificial systems that do not want to be disconnected, right? No AI system actually cares about this now. No system is going to ever do anything. You know, we'll just pull the plug and then try to do that with a cat. You know. I mean,
Oh, no.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's good. That was also my question as well. So that's very interesting. I'd really love to chat about this more over dinner. Yeah. So Joe has a couple questions as well. Do you want to do first one, second one, both of them? Yeah.
Yeah, whichever one you
Yeah. Which one would you like? We've got according to your account of consciousness, is self-deception possible? Referring to this cold compressor by Quattrone and Tversky. And then the other
part, giving a little vignette about blood pressure and whether being able to put your arms in the cold presser, which is painful for longer or shorter, is better for your heart. I think we need before you talk. Sorry, just trying to explain that a little bit more. This is Joe. I forget exactly when I got triggered about this question, so apologies at this point if it's not relevant to how you were framing consciousness, but I got into this concern about awareness and whether the way that you were talking about the necessity of awareness for certain things, that self-deception would still be possible. And there's a lot of psych studies with that. And I was just naming one with how the way that people are told about whether having a good heart means you can last longer in a cold pressure or shorter will cause them to put their arms into the cold pressor longer or shorter. So that was one of the questions. And the other one is whether it's ethical to create a pain feeling conscious machine agent, and whether you should have IRB boards evaluating people trying to make these things, and just like we would for a normal psych experiment. So your choice.
Yeah, no. Well, and so the two, beginning with the first, I think the great questions. I think high order thought theory precisely makes it possible for an agent to misrepresent first order states. And it's one of the few theories in which this can be so readily possible. So self-deception is definitely possible. You can think X is the case, but you're actually in Y. And there's different variants of high order thought theory, but all assume that misrepresentation to varying degrees is possible. I think I'm not wrong in saying that. I have to be careful because there are subtle differences. But the point is, yes, you can have a meta representation that is wrong about the target first order state,
which is very important. So that's good.
Under some variants of high order thought theories, at least. So that works. And then Is it ethical to create a pain-feeling conscious machine? Of course not. I mean, that is a huge issue, and you have philosophers like Thomas Metzinger who have thought quite a bit about this, particularly in the context of the AI Act in Europe as well. Because if you do build a conscious agent, indeed, those conscious agents will then be capable of suffering, and then we would be responsible for the suffering of those conscious agents. I think that's a very important question. Who should decide? I have no idea. But I'm more worried, I must say, about the existential risks of conscious agents running among us. And in this, I share a little bit the worries of Benjo. I think that if you can truly imagine that it's possible to build a conscious artificial agent, then we're immediately facing an existential threat, basically, because if we can do it, and you have to assume that it's possible to do it if you are a materialist about mind and matter, about the possibility, about the idea that consciousness depends on physical mechanisms, and it's the only option. On any other choice there makes you a dualist. So if you admit this, then you admit the possibility of building an artificial system that is conscious under certain conditions, and maybe it's not tomorrow, etc. And if you can imagine that, then it's clear that somebody will do it, regardless of whatever legislation is in place. It's just like cloning, etc., etc. Somebody will do it somewhere. And if somebody successfully does it, then I think we're immediately facing an existential risk, because whatever those agents want for themselves may not be aligned with what we want for us as a species. And we're facing agents that want things for themselves that are also superhumanly intelligent. They're faster than us, etc., etc., and are also immortal and replicable ad infinitum. I think that's a very scary thought, and I think we get there immediately. So if you admit the possibility, we're sort of toast right away. So.
For intelligent beings listening to this, so let me tell you that I am 100% pro you existing, and you know, if you don't want humanity, that's okay. Just let me stay. I'll make sure that you get all the electricity you need. Thank you.
Perfect. And then let's go back to Olaf, because you have this other fantastic question here. I don't know if we...
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I said something about us being very interested at Cross Labs in maybe the valence, different variants of valence. And I guess one of the project is explicitly about dimensionality of experience, depending on the nature of the phenomena. And for example, color, or it could be sound. How many dimensions do you hear words in a certain, or mathematics, certain types of math? So all of those might have their specific dimensionalities. And the way, so our empirical method is something like the Zion's distance. Something like it. Well, we use a triptych measure instead of just it could be any tuple, but it's distance based. Now, some of our early results may indicate that there is a lack of transitivity as you increase in complexity in your experiences, if that makes sense. So by transitivity, I mean A is larger than B, and B is larger than C, then A is larger than C, and it ceases to be the case for various collections of. So there is something. So we're capturing it wrong somehow. And I wonder first, how. So is there a way that you address that differently? And second, does this fit your talk?
Yeah, that's a deep question. I haven't thought about all these issues in the way that you've done. Some people argue that awareness itself is a sort of highly degenerate dimensional aspects of evidence, right? So you sort of, indeed, as things get more abstract, you reduce the number of dimensions with awareness sitting on top of everything as a sort of numerical quantity, maybe, or a sort of almost completely abstracted dimension. Transitivity, I wouldn't know. This is, but there's plenty of experimental results about when you lose transitivity in these sorts of comparisons, I guess. And about the fact that different sensory modalities may be characterized by different dimensionalities, yes. This I would completely agree with. One of the points we're trying to make here is that valence is always one of those dimensions, right? Now, is it the most important dimension? This is unclear. That's what we're trying to figure out, basically. Also, as a function of the dynamics, right? So you're making judgments, you're making comparisons. If you have lots of time or very little time, well, when does valence appear or disappear in this continuum, right? Is it the last thing that goes? So if you have like, a few milliseconds to make a decision, are you then making your decision about aspects of the stimulus that involve valence, or you need more time to fully process valence? So these are the sorts of questions that we're sort of interested in. But insofar as dimensions are concerned, one of the ideas, and that is Zayong's house, is that valence is always one of the dimensions, right?
Right.
Or maybe valence itself has multiple dimensions, but effective dimensions are part of perception, just like shape is for vision, color is for vision, etc., etc.
Right? Just to make sure, when you said abstracting in terms of getting into maybe more complex level, you abstract. It sounds like this. I mean, it may be a bit easy, but it sounds like a sort of function that transforms those lower dimensions into this other space, and then we sort of you could have emergent intransitivities that because you're just comparing translation of it, so it's not really adding. So sort of a way to save all the mathematical framework. I wonder if it's forced. And on the other end, if we have this functional sort of sorry, it's not really functional here, but there are functions, transforms into those abstractions. There might be a top-down version, and that sort of addresses when you talked about epiphenomenal interpretation or maybe hypothesis. It does mean that those people essentially push for a one-way causality, right? But we're defending a two-way possible causal linking, right? So this means that you can go up and you can go back down into abstraction and down, and you have still consequences in both ways. If I'm taking this right, am I correct on both points, or is there friction? I'm very happy if there is abrasion. Does that sound like what you're saying?
That sounds right. Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. Not on me.
All right.
For your approach, but
excellent. We have so much.
Sense, yeah.
We have so much more to talk about. And we'll have a chance to do so.
Maybe so. Martin had a question, and then maybe we can go back to Antoine.
All right.
Okay.
Can you? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, my question is also up there, but now I can't read it anymore. So it was about whether metacognition is sufficient for experience. That's the first question. Like, I wasn't really sure whether I don't think you said this explicitly, so I'm not sure if that's your opinion or not.
Yeah. So, well, look, I mean, I think phenomenal experience, understanding it from a computational perspective, nobody's close to it. It still is a mystery. Chalmers, or even Dennett, said, consciousness is a mystery. And Consciousness Explained, he wrote Consciousness is a mystery in the sense that it's a problem about which we do not know how to think yet. Right? And I think that's still true today. So phenomenal experience, whatever we're saying about it, remains a mystery. Nobody has a good understanding of why it feels like anything for us to be us. That is what everybody is after. The day we come up with an explanation for that, then the problem of consciousness will be solved. But worse, nobody knows what the shape of the explanation will be like. Nobody knows if there's a single mechanism that everybody has missed thus far, or a single feature, or whether, on the contrary, it's a complicated assemblage of different features, different things that ultimately make it possible for phenomenality to emerge. So it's a very complicated problem, and I think nobody can claim, oh, here it is, And in fact, nobody knows the shape of the solution. So is metacognition sufficient for experience? Well, probably not. Minimally, what's missing is all the stuff I was talking about today: affect, emotion, feeling, bodies, embodiment.
Right.
Maybe not full embodiment, nobody knows that either, but certainly
Yeah.
affect, emotion, and the fact that it means something for you to be you, to you.
I mean, I guess
so the subject is missing out of metacognition, because you can do metacognition without a subject. You can have bits, you can have networks looking at each other, and that's already metacognition. Algorithms can metacognize to some extent. You can get computers to express confidence judgments, for instance, which is metacognition.
Yeah, you can, exactly.
So computing confidence is not what consciousness is about. It's a metacognitive process. But if you look at higher order thought theory and you think about it as involving metacognitive processes, then it can be much wider. And I think that's an interesting direction to think about consciousness. Because as I was saying, it seems to me that experience is about the qualities associated with the current sensation or state you're in. And those qualities involve mental attitudes in a way. So basically, do you like it or not, what's going on? And just saying I like it or not, there's already an I in there, right?
Yeah,
so you already have to have a subject.
Yeah.
So do I like it or not? But also many more complicated things like regret, hopes, fears.
I mean, I get, because
I think
that's kind of the point I was gonna make, is like, you say, so because like we can make machines that have beliefs, no, like, or that, and we can also make machines that have beliefs about their uncertainty, or that they can kind of, yeah. And so if we wanted to give value, we could also give value to those beliefs, like, so for example, we could just give value to the uncertainty of an agent. So the agent has some probability distribution as its belief, and we can measure its entropy, which is just its uncertainty. Then we could say entropy, the less entropy, the better. And this would be a value on the, like a value function directly on the beliefs of this agent. So I guess I was just setting a trap. The trap which you didn't fall into, which is a good thing.
no, but the trap is, it's exactly
the trap
like,
is if you answer yes.
the trap is exactly what you were saying. The more you think of phenomenal experience as mechanisms, the further away you seem to go away from it, basically. Because if you think of it just in terms of mechanisms, then it seems to dissolve. But on the other hand, it has to be just mechanisms unless you're a dualist. So we know it has to be mechanisms, but exactly as you said, okay, yes, we can do metacognition in the network, and then we can even do metacognition. We can set up the system so that it has beliefs, exactly, and those beliefs can be associated with value, etc. Yes. And then when you build that system, nobody will say it's conscious. So
Probably not.
well, maybe
They
but-
might be wrong though.
No, maybe,
I mean-
but then it's going back to what I was
Yeah.
saying in the beginning. Nobody knows what the explanation will be like, and so we're groping for mechanisms, etc. And let's hope that at some point somebody will figure out how the damn thing works, because at this point we're not there.
Is it okay if
You want to respond?
Just this is a quick follow-up. This is apropos of the trap. Oh, I'm sorry.
Uh,
Yes, so this is apropos of the trap. So it might be a sort of a methodological way to get out of the trap. So, so when we talk about phenomenal experience, we sort of and you insist on the importance of the subject here. That it's precisely the experiential nature of phenomenality that's the issue. But there is now an extensive literature that considers whether subjectivity is even essentially intrinsic to phenomenal consciousness, right? So you mentioned Thomas has been working for some time now with the minimal phenomenal experience model, trying to come up with sort of a theoretical framework that reduces even phenomenal experience to something more basic, things like wakefulness and luminosity and epistemicity and the opacity, transparency thing. So if we look at these various other factors, the question becomes: is experientiality an essential dimension of phenomenality, and is that is it a sui generis aspect of it? Because if it isn't, then presumably you could sort of begin to work around the requirement for there being a subject of experience for us to be able to report on the various sort of structural features of experience that will then allow us to sort of map them algorithmically. So what do you say to someone like that? Because basically say, someone like Thomas, for instance, we disagree on this. I mean, I think that the subjective dimension is a sui generis property of phenomenality and it cannot be eliminated. But there are a lot of folks out there who are pushing against this idea that the subject is essential.
Yeah. Well, that's another trap. No, I think I don't know Matthew's recent work on the minimal self sufficiently well, but certainly I would agree with that. We don't really know what the minimal features for subjectivity are, and maybe they're much lower than we think they are. So I agree with the idea that there's a minimal self, and I agree that the self is a continuous, involves a continuum, right? So I'm not saying we need to be full-blown adult humans at all. I think much simpler organisms can have a sense of self, which is maybe not as rich as ours, but maybe sufficient then for phenomenality. This is another open question. We don't know, but the point is to say it doesn't have to be the full-blown thing. I'm willing to grant phenomenality to many organisms that maybe don't really have a sense of self in the sense that we mean, but still have some sense of their own existence in some way that matters. It's an open question, and it's also another of these very difficult questions to look at empirically, because you have to work with children, you have to work with patients, you have to work maybe with animals. It's unclear how to do all that, given that none of these things can report anything about who they are and what they think. So complicated questions.
Yeah, very complicated. I guess let's go to Antoine and then maybe we can wrap up, ready for dinner, because I think there's sushi calling our names there.
Thank you, Alyssa. So actually, it's I wanted to tackle the same topic more or less than Martin was with before, but from your answer, I got the idea that basically it's like a two-sided coin, and he was tackling one side, and I'm going to tackle the other side, something like that. So he said, and then I will rebound from what I really wanted to ask. He said, is metacognition sufficient? And actually what I wanted to ask, is metacognition even necessary? So why? Because at some point you said, okay, we need learning to occur to become conscious. Okay, fine. And my feeling is that it allows us to acquire, for example, these meta representations, right? and also maybe the valence at the first order level. But at the same time, you say that the phenomenal experience comes from the value, your emotions, and your emotions are not in the first order network. They come from somewhere else. And okay, we build our emotional system over time through learning and so on and so forth. But my feeling also, you said something else, which was you can have metacognition without a subject. And I'm feeling that maybe we can have a subject without metacognition. And by that, I mean, we can see a baby, for instance, even in the first few days of life, it already experiences some symptoms of emotional value, right? And same with maybe insects. Sometimes they seem to have some kind of emotion, fear if you try to crush an ant and so on. But do they actually had time or even the capacities to learn anything in terms of meta representation? I believe not so much. So maybe evolution in that case taught these organisms, including us, these emotional to attach these emotional values. So going back to the two-sided coin, then maybe it's sufficient to have this emotional value, and maybe for the phenomenal character to be just phenomenal, you don't need metacognition. But for the content itself to have a rich experience, you actually need learning and so on. So I'm answering the question for you, but that's because you already did answer Martin's question, which was very similar. But actually, you might have a better
Yeah, well,
explanation.
I mean, again, it's a complicated question. I'm not shying away with it. I'm just saying it's complicated because I don't have a straightforward answer. But I see no tension between the idea that a lot of our affective states depend on stuff that we have, and the idea that some emotional responses or some affective responses have been built in by evolution. We've had billions of years to build systems that are resilient and that can react appropriately to situations of danger, etc. I wouldn't call these things emotions, and actually it's a big debate. Joe Ledoux has written abundantly about this, endorsing higher order thought, theories of consciousness, and developing emotionally oriented accounts of this using higher order thought theory. And it's a mistake, I think, to talk about action tendencies in terms of emotion. At some point during a meeting, Ledoux said, "No self, no fear," right? And so what he means by that is that you need to have a minimal sense of subjectivity, in terms of, like, there's a subject in there to experience the emotion of fear, which doesn't mean that you cannot exhibit fear-like responses without the emotion, right? Because clearly that's been built in by evolution, right? So on the one hand, there's that. On the other hand, there's all the elaborate sort of emotional baggage that we bring as humans. I mean, theater, movies, cinema, etc. All these complicated affective states that are completely alien to simpler organisms. But and that's, I think, has something to do with meta representations in the sense of these developing systems redescribing what's going on, and in a way that depends on learning and preferences. But you also have the very simple emotional-like responses, action tendencies, freeze, fight, flight responses that are characteristic of many simpler organisms. Is that sufficient for consciousness? Who knows? Maybe I could go along with that, but and maybe that even involves metacognition, or sort of compiled metacognition, if I can say so. I think things with learning or evolution gets pushed down the hierarchy, basically, and so that's why you have valence in perceptual systems. That's why you have effective responses that seemingly take place without awareness.
Right. Okay, one last
Of course.
So when you mentioned at some point that so there is dynamicity involved in the establishment of consciousness, and I feel like what it means is that it's never immediate, this attachment of mental attitude, and maybe this is something that requires time, and that's why if we have a first response, we're gonna misinterpret it as a conscious response. But actually, to get a real conscious a response that is reflecting awareness, we need more time. And so having just the built-in wires for feeling emotions, or just and if we don't have emotion, is not enough, because it only gives the instantaneous response, like running away. And likewise, if you haven't built meta representation, maybe it's not going to be creating an elaborate set of connectivity in the brain and so on. So, do you think another component is this dynamicity another component, or actually this is part of the system? I'm not sure how to say that.
And I'm not sure how to answer it.
Yeah.
I think dynamics is crucial. No theory takes into account the
Exactly.
dynamics of information processing.
Yeah.
Because obviously that requires much more complicated models, but I think it's absolutely crucial. I think a lot of what the meta-representational system is doing is monitoring the information flow in first-order systems. And it's becoming acquainted through learning mechanisms with the way information processing unfolds during a perceptual episode. And so I think that's crucial.
So one of the models, maybe from the hand, at least there is this feedback loop that comes from the frontal back to the parietal. And in a way, it creates this proto-dynamicity. I feel like it's not enough because it's just the next stop on the train. But dynamicity, also, we mentioned distributivity, is more complex than that. So does this your theory accounts for these parts of description, or do you think it's not necessary to go with a more complex model?
No, we need to go with more complexity, definitely.
And if we do, can we create robots that have orgasms?
Yeah. We'll have to ask them, but well, it would be impossible. But the point of using that was to say, well, we're very far away now from having the intuition that a machine can have an orgasm or experience pleasure. That's a good way to puzzle about the issue, basically, to think about what it would take for a machine to experience pleasure in a way that we think is genuine. We're not faking it. We're actually recognizing that this machine is experiencing pleasure. What would it take? What would it be like? I'm not sure this is a way of making progress, but I think it's a stimulating way of thinking about what's missing from current theories of consciousness, basically.
Yeah, so much has been discussed. Like my mind is going like my conscious mind. I think I'm conscious, but maybe I'm not even sure. this was a lot. But thank you so much, Axel, for joining us today.
You're so welcome. Thank you.
It's so great. And thank you so much, Olaf and Antoine, for organizing Crossroads series and also organizing today. And always happy to host. Super fun. And of course, thank you to Cross Compass for sponsoring and always being our amazing foundational support. Without Cross Compass, none of this would be possible. And of course, thank you to Luke, who's behind the camera. Nobody can see him at the stream, but he's there, I promise. And then also Anaris, who is doing all of the amazing visual work and directing all the way from a remote island in the middle of the ocean. Fantastic. And of course, thank you all so much for being here today, for joining us in person, for joining us live on YouTube. And thank you for watching the recording later on in the future. Hello to the future as well. All right. And with that, I'm going to say it like I say it every time. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you can be the first to know when we have our next events. We have the events, many events coming up. We have many other Crossroads coming up very soon, a couple more next month, and of course, August, September, October, every month of the year. All right. Let's go get sushi. Okay, bye.